Howdy folks, today we're looking at the first issue of Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja from 1989 in Marvel Comics. Perhaps you've never heard of the Nth Man, or perhaps you've heard it referred to condescendingly, grouped alongside other such oddities as US1 or NFL Super Pro. Do not doubt this strange book is one of the most interesting experiments in Marvel history. Nth Man is the brainchild of Larry Hama, longtime Marvel editor and mastermind behind the company's epical G.I. Joe comic, as well as a considerable stretch writing Wolverine. The subject here is nothing less than World War III, the climactic confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. That apocalyptic tension was front and center in people's minds throughout the 1980s. Certainly, Hama's run on G.I. Joe profited immensely from the looming shadow of that theoretical conflict. Unlike Joe, however, this book didn't need to mask those fears with toyetic euphemism. The catalyst for World War III in the universe of the Nth Man is actually a familiar trope from the era. There's precisely one superpowered individual in this world, an unbalanced psychic named Alfie Omegan. That's the kind of bad pun you should expect from any Hama book, if you're not familiar. And with the power of his mind, Alfie has rendered inert every nuclear weapon on the planet. Removing mutually assured destruction from the equation triggers instantaneous conflict. So yes, right off the bat we find ourselves in the neighborhood of Watchmen and Akira, similar stories defined by unbalanced individuals of great power, conceived in the anxious shadow of an impossible war. And in this morass we find John Doe, the titular Ultimate Ninja. Any similarities to Remo Williams was surely coincidental, considering both characters possess near superhuman fighting abilities gained under the tutelage of a gruff Asian martial arts master. Hama's preoccupation with the internal politics of ninja clans was a defining obsession of the 1980s, building on Frank Miller's Daredevil to give the world the likes of Snake Eyes, Storm Shadow, and the Ashikaga clan. John Doe is cut from that same cloth, the crucial difference being that the Nth Man, being the ultimate ninja, also sports a mullet. As an artifact of the very end of the Cold War, Nth Man is uniquely fascinating. Of course, no one in this country knew just how close to dissolution the Soviet Union was at the time. Dramatic irony that casts its own shadow. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja number 2 from 1989 in Marvel Comics. After the breakneck pace of the first issue, the follow-up slows down just a tick, but only just a tick. The titular Ultimate Ninja is stuck trying to escape from Russia during World War III, accompanied by his mentor, Dr. Irving Yagyu, DDS, and Sergeant Deb Levins, who the narration informs us is a cute Green Beret, the armed forces in this world having allowed women into combat roles at least 25 years before ours. This trio is left to fend for themselves in the wake of the desolation of the Chinese Army's retreat from Moscow, although said retreat may just turn out to have been a feint for the purpose of destroying the Soviets' main motor rifle divisions. Yes, we are in the trusted hands of Larry Hama, someone who understands war and, what's more, understands how to build adventure stories around the events of war. Again, this series removes the layer of euphemism that swaddled Hama's G.I. Joe. That book would never show a bloody heap of bodies lying under a wall after a summary execution by retreating forces, as this does. For a series supposedly built around the conflict between an omnipotent psychic and the world's greatest ninja, Nth Man is primarily occupied so far with the realities of total mechanized warfare in a world without nuclear weapons. The setup here gives us a war in which the Soviets have essentially rolled over much of Europe, leaving only Scandinavian partisan fighters to carry the fight, while the People's Liberation Army of China works in concert with the United States to expose Russia's eastern flank. This is a well-thought-out war game. Now let's see what happens when the omnipotent psychic decides to start throwing his weight around. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja number 3 from 1989 in Marvel Comics. Let's step back today for a closer look at the art by Ron Wagner with inks by Fredericks. Wagner was 5 years into his career by now. Like a number of early Kubrick School graduates, his early credits are on Sergeant Rock, as well as various odds and ends like the 80s incarnation of Hex and First Comics' Badger. However, it's once he gets picked up by Marvel that he really hits his stride, working with writer Larry Hama on G.I. Joe for much of 1987 and 88, in addition to various covers for books like Conan and the Nam. Undoubtedly, it was that facility with men's adventure stories that made him such an ideal partner for Hama. In the first place, he's committed to providing the technical accuracy that Hama's stories demand. Nth Man is filled not just with military hardware, but precise military hardware. This is the kind of series with frequent editorial notes detailing specific vehicles and weapons used by Soviet forces. In some comics, it might not matter that much, but in this comic, it definitely matters quite a bit that the armored troop carriers and attack helicopters look at least vaguely like they're supposed to. Valuable verisimilitude in a comic wherein action sequences depend on the precise usage of wire-guided anti-tank missiles. The main antagonist here is a MiL Mi-24 helicopter gunship, and a quick Google search tells me that Wagner got it right. That chopper was introduced by the Soviets in 1972 and is apparently still in use by armies across the world. Not a small detail. Much of this issue spent setting up a massive tank battle between Soviet forces and the Chinese Chinese People's Army. The success of the story depends on the degree to which the reader understands that these are real weapons with real limitations, not magic toy accessories drawn to accommodate the whims of story. None of this works without a patient artist who cares to take the time to get it right. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja #4 from Marvel Comics in 1989. The opening narration informs us that we are somewhere southeast of Moscow, 6 months and 3 days after the start of World War III. After 2 issues of build-up, the battle has caught up to our heroes, still marooned on the steppes of Russia after the first issue's daring rescue. John Doe, Sergeant Levin, and Irving Yagyu, DDS, are still cruising around in a stolen personnel carrier filled with children rescued from a Russian village demolished by the Chinese offensive, but soon find themselves on foot after an American airstrike of a Soviet field hospital demolishes their wheels. Our unlikely trio find themselves hunted by the series' main antagonist to date, Colonel Varvara Novikova, a woman whose life depends on retaking the prisoner who escaped from under her watch. This issue's all about the fog of war, characters screaming in the darkness because they're dying, lost, or in shock. Shock isn't something a lot of war stories want to deal with, but also one of the inevitable consequences of life in wartime. The screams of a distraught Russian nurse open up a memory inside John Doe of a flashback to his and Alfie's childhood in the Iowa orphanage in which they were raised. The psychic connection between Doe and Alfie channels all these memories right back to the surface for our titular Ultimate Ninja, so we see the vivid recollection of anguish felt by the orphanage's cook on learning that her son had been killed in Vietnam. The story cuts back and forth between Alfie's psychic flashbacks and the present, with Colonel Novikova ordering a group of naval infantrymen to hunt down Doe through the tall grass in the dark, with a spearhead of Chinese armor bearing down on their position. John Doe snaps back to reality just in time to help mow down the naval infantry, thanks to the scent of Colonel Novikova's brand of perfume, Calvin Klein's Obsession. As if this story couldn't be any more of an 80s period piece. One of Hama's themes from G.I. Joe, underlined here for repeated emphasis. There's no ideology present for troops on the ground fighting a war. There are orders and there's motivated reasoning. Everything else falls by the wayside. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja #5 from Marvel Comics in 1989. The long retreat from Moscow continues for John Doe, the titular Ultimate Ninja, accompanied by his mentor Irving Yagyu, DDS, Sergeant Deb Levins, and Sasha, the Russian Boy Scout who fell in with 3 Americans after helping to save their lives from Russian commandos last issue. Sasha's having a bit of a breakdown here, as seen on the cover, given that he's a child who understands that he's committed treason. The narrative is getting more complex as the series progresses. The issue begins in 1968 with Dr. Yagyu crawling through tunnels in Cu Chi, Vietnam, having been sent from America to assassinate a certain North Vietnamese poet. In these tunnels, we're also introduced to Tyrone Parrish, who gives his life saving Dr. Yagyu from a VC grenade. That's why and how Dr. Yagyu ends up at the Iowa Orphanage, where John Doe and Alfie O'Megan were raised, and where he first crosses paths with the boy who would become his star pupil. Already we're given evidence that the time stream has been changed, or is being changed by Alfie's powers. His first taste of time travel sends the young Alfie around the bend, a process that results in him learning to see multiple points simultaneously. The similarities to Watchmen are inescapable, with a godlike being suffering dissociative episodes based on his inability to parse the passage of time. The difference here is that Alfie is anything but detached from the world around him. On the contrary, Alfie is very much engaged, paranoid, resentful, and angry. An assassination attempt inspires him to transform into Godzilla, crushing a mob of screaming soldiers into a thin paste. Meanwhile, Colonel Novikova, under interrogation from the American intelligence liaison officer stationed with the Chinese army, prior to being offered a job of hunting the AWOL John Doe. The theme here is one of Hama's oldest, a consistent note strummed throughout the entire run of his G.I. Joe. Wars are often just a distraction for the subterranean movements of intelligence agencies, buried agendas that inevitably diverge and even conflict with the rationales proffered to the soldiers fighting and dying. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja #6 from Marvel Comics in 1989. As good as the previous 5 issues of Nth Man have been, it seems as if this is the issue where they really start to cook. There's a lot of ingredients here, and they've taken a little while to put together. In the first place, Larry Hama is writing a military book that goes one step further than the toyetic scrum of G.I. Joe by replacing the toys with actual grown-up military units, wargaming a version of World War III that doesn't involve thermonuclear destruction. In the second place, he's writing a book about about a small group of people who just happen to fall into the orbit of a capricious living god. And not just any living god, an amoral sociopath with enough power to pretend to be Galactus, just like in the Fantastic Four comics he read as a kid. Although I do believe that much of the book takes Watchmen as a springboard, the final element that really clicks into place this issue is a criticism of fanboy culture, already rancid by the late 80s and in many ways antithetical to Hama's oft-stated preferences as both a creator and a fan. Alfie O'Meagan's resentful entitlement, even if reinforced by a genuinely unpleasant childhood, is a prophetic fable about how, for some people, everything will never be enough. This issue sees Alfie demolishing the Lincoln Memorial, for instance, just so he has a nice place to sit while he watches TV in his Galactus cosplay. And of course, we have the figure of John Doe, close in conception to Snake Eyes, another cool-as-a-cucumber ninja type, albeit one more adapted to a world where superpowers are a real thing, if extraordinarily rare. As far as high concepts go, Snake Eyes versus Dr. Manhattan isn't so bad. The only thing missing for Larry Hama Bingo is an incongruous, funny animal, but with 10 issues to go, I'm hopeful that we can get there. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja number 7 from Marvel Comics in 1989. The story continues to get weirder as Alfie O'Meagan's reality warping powers continue to make things weirder for our heroes. The story begins with John Doe held at gunpoint by both American and Soviet forces. He's able to talk himself out of that tight spot, of course, although he's soon being shot at once again by Colonel Novikova. Dr. Yagi was still trapped in the barn with the dying Sergeant Deb Levin, joined now by Sergeant Sargent, John Doe's firearms instructor, and almost certainly Larry Hama's hat tip to the great Joseph Heller. But within no time flat, John Doe and Colonel Vivara both learned the truth about the mysterious farm on which they've been ambushed. It's actually a Russian military laboratory devoted to adapting warheads filled with now inert nuclear fissile material to carry chemical and biological agents, a process the story assures us is almost certainly also being conducted by the United States military. Meanwhile, the Watchmen parallels continue with the introduction of yet another improbably named character, Dr. Candy Goodstroke, who arrives in Washington to try and get inside Alfie's head. She's brought with her Rorschach test, of course, which inevitably just happened to look like an axe murderer wearing a clown costume. Is that insight into Alfie's character going to be relevant? Well, next issue promises another flashback to Alfie and John's childhood at the orphanage, teased in the next issue box as Hot Time at the Orphanage or Ask Me No Questions. This could, in other hands, be a very grim story, what with it being about ninjas battling omnipotent psychics in the middle of World War III. Larry Hama, however, is bound and determined to keep things as light as he can. The Heller connection is important here and to Hama's entire corpus. Hama's intimate familiarity with military life and dedication to capturing its rhythms and mores in what he writes is undergirded by a deep and abiding sense of the absurd. That's one reason G.I. Joe is as funny as it is. There's a deadpan fatalism about military life that comes through even in the toy book, the wisdom of human institutions designed to deal with constant destabilizing change as a way of life. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja number 8 from Marvel Comics in 1989. In the first place, it must be said that this is one of my favorite covers in the history of the medium, like an EC comic unmoored in time that just happened to land on a Marvel mag some 4 decades late. The issue itself is a flashback to John and Alfie's youth at the orphanage, a miserable childhood by any measure that gets even worse here. As we've already seen so far in the series, the Maryvale Home for Boys was in general a miserable place, run by the aptly named Mr. Bigot, who gleefully skimmed the county payments for the boys' upkeep for the purpose of buying a mink farm and retiring with Nurse Gooch, sour-faced and constantly smoking. The most important thing in the world for young Alfie is his comic book collection, a complete run of Lee and Kirby Fantastic Four, along with a number of other Silver Age classics kept neat in a box and shared only with his pal John. The crux of the issue here is Alfie learning to use his terrible powers, enabled by a shadow of his future self whispering through time to influence the confused and angry child. Of course, Mr. Bigot didn't actually need Alfie's help to fly into a murderous rage. The story tells us quite clearly he's got anger problems and no compunctions about taking out his frustrations on the children in his care. This is where we see John's mettle, even as a child, taking full-on beatings from a grown man for the specific purpose of saving his friends the same fate. Eventually, Alfie gets adopted out of the system by the kindly O'Meagan family, but a malicious mix-up with his precious box of comics inspires the murderous rage that comes to a fruition with Mr. Bigot's fateful assault on the children with an axe. Notable here is the fill-in artwork from a very young Dale Keown. After 3 years paying dues in the proverbial minor leagues on books like Warlock 5 and Dragon Force, first at Aircel and then at Malibu after Aircel became a division of Malibu, Nth Man is Keown's first Marvel credit. This specific issue is a story about unhappy childhood in the long shadow of child abuse, challenging subject matter that carried over to his star-making work on Peter David's Hulk just a couple months later. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Marvel Comics Presents 25 from 1989. Since we've hit the halfway mark in our recitation of the Nth Man, this seemed a good time to double back for the character's actual first appearance, not in his own series, but as a backup feature here in Marvel's premiere anthology. Marvel Comics Presents launched in 1988 and lasted until 95, an achievement all the more impressive when you realize MCP was a bi-weekly book and racked up 175 issues for its first volume. Each issue featured 4 stories, and most issues carried some mixture of good, bad, and indifferent. It sold well on the newsstand, but suffered when that retail model broke down as the 90s wore on. One of the book's purposes, at least at the outset, was to preview forthcoming projects. Other notable late 80s launches like Quasar, Damage Control, and John Byrne's She-Hulk all premiered in these pages, just as Nth Man made his first appearance as well, just a couple short weeks prior to the release of his first issue. In terms of breaking down the premise of a rather unusual book, this preview actually gives us important information not proffered in the series itself. We're introduced to John and Alfie as kids at the Maryvale Orphanage, and we also see the boys taking advantage of Alfie's strange powers to catch a glimpse into their futures. John is understandably upset that his friend has magical powers, able to show him a vision of his future self being taken captive by the Spetsboro and imprisoned at the Lubyanka prior to the events of issue 1, as well as establishing young John's crush on the future apparition of Colonel Novikova. We also see Alfie's future self in the process of destroying the nuclear armaments. From the very beginning, then, we are aware not just that Alfie is gifted with the visions of the future, but that these visions, perhaps sent by his future self according to issue 8, are almost certainly driving the boy mad. The rest of the issue is a grab bag in the true MCP tradition. There's a chapter of Don McGregor and Gene Colan's harrowing apartheid-era epic Panther's Quest, part of a Havoc solo turn by Howard Mackey and Rich Buckler, and the last story is an Ursa Major spotlight written by a very young Scott Lobdell. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja number 9 from 1989 in Marvel Comics. After 2 weeks of flashbacks, we're back to the present of the story. It's World War III, the nukes are gone, but the missiles are about to fly anyway. Just instead of thermonuclear payloads, they've been outfitted with biological agents. Our boy Alfie probably could stop them if he wanted, but he's too busy playing with John Doe and Colonel Novikova, transported to Washington, D.C. in the blink of an eye for the benefit of their omnipotent puppet master. This issue's flashback to 1968 details the immediate aftermath of the fire at the Maryvale Orphanage, in which John Doe was adopted by Dr. Yagyu and taken away to California, there to be raised in the way of the ninja. Dr. Yagyu sees the potential in young John, as well as the importance of his connection to the strange boy whose psychic powers were already beginning to influence the world around him. Of course, John seems none the worse for wear for having been trained and conditioned from a young age to become the ultimate ninja. On the contrary, he appears in the present of the series almost preternaturally cheerful and well-balanced for someone who makes their living in the field of death. He's familiar enough with video games, for instance, to recognize the nature of the death trap Alfie springs for him and the Colonel, placing them inside a game and forcing them to battle pixelated Necro ninjas for the purpose of saving the princess, the psychologist Dr. Candy Goodstroke, which again is a real name Larry Hama gave a character. She at least accepts the situation with aplomb, which is better than most people would probably react to becoming a toy of a living god. All this takes place as the war grinds on. Soviet tanks arrive in upstate New York at the moment the missiles leave their silos in Iowa, just as Dr. Yagyu and his crew, still fighting to escape Russia, see the missiles flying on their end. More and more plates are set to spin as the world crumbles in the grip of a madman who only seems to care about torturing his erstwhile best friend. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja number 10 from 1989 in Marvel Comics. We pick up this week with the continuation of last issue's cliffhanger. The missiles have been launched from both sides, only filled with biological agents to substitute for the nuclear material disappeared by Alfie, the inciting action that spurred the start of World War III. The name of this story is 22 Minutes, the time from the moment the missiles are launched to their first landfall at their respective targets. Of course, Alfie isn't happy to learn that the war has accelerated so precipitously. This issue offers us a bit of insight into Alfie's character as more than simply a maladjusted and mentally ill danger. The fact is, he has been genuinely disappointed, in his almost childlike way, that getting rid of nuclear weapons didn't spur any kind of peace, and in fact had precisely the opposite effect. He's not trying to destroy the human race. In his twisted brain, he genuinely believes he's trying to save it, which is why, as soon as he's informed of the missiles having launched, he sets about fixing the problem in the only way he knows how, splitting his consciousness into 12,586 parts and tracking down each and every missile flying through the stratosphere. He can't outright stop them all with his power so distributed, but he can try and render the biological payloads inert by messing with the RNA of the engineered viruses. Of course, things don't quite go according to plan when a rogue general uses the specter of imminent destruction to try and even the score with Alfie by offering an unkind revelation regarding his beloved foster parents. Meanwhile, with Alfie so distracted, John and Colonel Novikova are free to escape the video game world in which they've been caught, a process which then entails them being captured by the U.S. military the moment they reach the outside. It would perhaps be incorrect to assert that the sexual tension between John Doe and the Colonel is overpowering, but his commitment to get under her skin certainly seems like the kind of thing the CIA agent would do if they wanted to flirt with the KGB officer. Through it all, the series maintains Hama's commitment to the premise that the people who give orders in the military have no idea what they're doing. As he says in the letters page of this issue, I don't expect logical decisions from officers. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja number 11 from 1990 in Marvel Comics. It's the end of the world as they know it, but things are feeling strangely fine for the gang. Alfie may not have stopped every missile, but he appears to have been able to stop just enough to prevent total apocalypse. The few places they were able to explode do appear to suffer the effects of the plague strains, further mutated by Alfie to unknown ends. Speaking of Alfie, he's at the end of his rope, overwhelmed by the effort of fighting off the entire world and unsure as to his next move. Leave it to the good Dr. Goodstroke, who thinks fast and inspires Alfie to live up to the example of Galactus by leaving the Earth forever in search of the life in the rest of the universe. Of course, she probably wasn't planning on him needing a herald or her being transformed by Alfie into a distaff version of the Silver Surfer, but that's enough for Alfie. With the Lincoln Monument as his de facto spaceship, he lifts off and away from Earth, accompanied only by his new herald. Will this mark the end of Alfie's threat? Almost certainly not, but it gets him off the board for the moment. As for the ostensible star of the book, after an ambush by Russian infiltrators in U.S. military uniform, John Doe finds himself chasing Colonel Novikova down the streets of Washington, D.C. Of course, she has a key to a safe house in Georgetown, and of course that safe house is manned by a bevy of beautiful babes wielding Kalashnikovs aimed squarely at John Doe the moment he opens the door. It must not be overlooked that Nth Man is a resolutely horny series, in touch with its raging libido in a way that G.I. Joe never really could be, given its putative audience. Sure, Baroness and Zorana certainly did their share for the prepubescent boys of America, and surely a few girls as well, but genuine sexual tension simmers throughout this series between John and the Colonel, still somehow wearing that same strategically torn evening gown for a solid year of stories. And of course there's Dr. Candy Goodstroke, stripped to her underwear and painted silver, just like graduate school all over again. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja number 12 from 1990 in Marvel Comics. Never let it be said that this series was boring. The main action this issue consists of landing a Russian bomber in the middle of Washington, D.C., with Pennsylvania Avenue as the landing strip. That's the ship that was hijacked in the previous issue by Dr. Irving Yagyu, Ninja Dentist, along with his friends and ours, Sergeants Levin and Sargent, gun barrels to the head of the Soviet pilots all the way from Russia to American airspace. It's only down to luck that they don't end up blown to pieces on the way to Washington. All-out war is broken out over American skies. Again, it's worth pointing out there's no small historical irony here in positing that the Soviet armed forces would have been able to take territory anywhere in the lower 48, such as here with the Soviet army establishing a beachhead in upstate New York. To be fair, no one in the West really knew how deep the rot was set in the Soviet system. The attempted coup that brought the whole hollow scaffolding crashing down was just a handful of months away when this comic was printed in 1990. The one part of the system that was still humming along was, of course, the KGB. And this issue begins with an exploration of the Soviet safe house in downtown Washington, a brothel in all but name, surely dedicated to cultivating the juiciest compromat. Still, even given the putative restrictions of the comics code on the cover, we get a walking tour of a Soviet sex dungeon, right before John Doe steals a 54 Testarossa to help land the aforementioned bomber, which ultimately lands safely, skidding to a stop at the steps of the Capitol building. That the issue begins with John tied up to a chair by a group of KGB swallows, the real-world unit specifically trained for compromising sex, and ends with John finally earning a kiss from Colonel Novikova, proves that for John Doe, the ultimate ninja, the end of the world is no reason not to live your best life. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja, number 13 from 1990 in Marvel Comics. Now, in all honesty, I have expected the answer to what will Alfie O'Megan find in the great big galaxy might be nothing. That seems in keeping with Hama's general attitude towards more grounded iterations of sci-fi tropes. However, that was not to be the case. Sure enough, Alfie finds life elsewhere in the galaxy. He also finds himself in the plot of a pretty famous Looney Tune. You know, the one where Bugs shows up and notices that everyone is suddenly running the other way, because there's a Tasmanian devil coming down the path. Yes, and Alfie finds himself playing Bugs Bunny in this scenario to a massive extraterrestrial menace named Magubgub, big as a planet and apparently not a benevolent soul. Looking back on the earlier comparisons to Watchmen, what is interesting here is how Hama never even considers the idea that absolute power could possibly fall into the hands of someone with an even temperament. It's not that power corrupts so much as human beings are simply incompatible with power and would lose their minds. That's more or less fits with his view of power on a human scale as well. Even back to G.I. Joe, the concept is riven with examples of the Joe team being used as political pawns by the government, no matter how arbitrary or self-defeating the circumstances. Meanwhile, back on Earth, we see the fog of war on the ground, as the aftermath of Doc Yagu landing a Russian bomber in the middle of the U.S. Capitol proves that no one at that point in the conflict has any idea what anyone else is doing or why it's happening. They're all just going through the motions until John Doe exercises some kind of psychic power of his own to bring the mess to a temporary halt. It's not explicitly called an Arashikage mindset, but if you've read G.I. Joe, you should know to expect weird stuff to happen when ninjas make strange hand gestures in a Larry Hama comic. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja, number 14 from 1990 in Marvel Comics. Easing into the home stretch of the book, we reach a natural impasse. The next issue blurb promises a time skip of one whole year, a telltale sign that the story is going to be wrapped up in an abbreviated form. As originally planned, Nth Man was set to run 2 years, and as it happened, it only made it to 16 issues. Although there are probably a number of reasons why the book failed to find traction, a slightly confusing title, being out of continuity, being mostly a war book in an era when the support for war books outside of Hama's own G.I. Joe was drying up. At the end of the day, it was a Marvel book without superheroes, and furthermore deeply skeptical about the very idea of superheroes. Marvel was already beginning to have trouble selling anything that wasn't superheroes. From war books to kids' books to more dramatic fare, it was an era that saw diverse offerings from both the big two companies wither and die on the vine. But with 2 issues left to go, Hama wasn't about to let up. The main action this issue is the resolution of the showdown promised last issue, with John Doe and Colonel Novikova in their Ferrari run down by American soldiers in jeeps and Russian spies in a VW van. The Russians are waiting for backup in the form of a Spetsnaz unit, having stolen an M1A1 Abrams tank. If you were worried that our boy John Doe might have some trouble taking down a tank, allow me to put your fears to rest. He grabs a live grenade thrown at him by the KGB and throws it down the turret of the tank during the 4 seconds it takes to reload the main gun. He also does this while dodging the tank at the wheel of the aforementioned Testarossa, and having a flashback to his childhood, with Doc Yagu teaching the boy how to throw a ball and play catch. As for Alfie, well, he's still loose in the great wide galaxy, having learned that the universe is filled with creatures even more powerful and intimidating than he is. And we haven't even met Magubgub yet. We just see his shadow cast across half the galaxy as he bears down on Alfie and the cosmically enhanced Dr. Goodstroke. As the wise man once said, there is always a bigger fish. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja, number 15 from 1990 in Marvel Comics, the penultimate issue in the saga of the Ultimate Ninja. As promised, this issue jumps ahead in time 1 year, dropping us right into the middle of the war that followed World War III. Much of the world is ruled by hideous mutants, the product of the same biological agents that Alfie tried to render inert before being rudely interrupted. In the heartland of America, the mutant armies are ruled by the hideous specters of Mr. Bigot and Nurse Gooch, shambling undead mutant warlords left alive by Alfie. The story begins in media res with a car chase and gunfight. Sergeant Deb Levin riding shotgun blazing her M16 with John Doe at the wheel of the Testarossa, repainted in camo colors, of course. The Russian and American special forces who spent the last 14 issues trying to kill each other come together against the mutant uprising. Things change in an instant, however, when Alfie finally returns home, having been chased across the universe and back by the menace of Magubgub, strong enough to instill the fear of God into the most powerful man in human history. Along the way, we're given more insight into the origins of the Nth Man and the reason why he retains a spark of Alfie's power. There's time travel involved, with the zombie Bigot and Gooch traveling back to 1974 for the express purpose of killing the Nth Man. After the deliberate tempo of the book's first year, it can't but be slightly jarring to see plot lines unspooled with such dispatch. You can easily imagine how these events could have benefited from a more relaxed rollout, but alas, that's what happens when a book only makes it through 2/3 of its run. Some things invariably get left by the wayside. Perhaps the book would have devoted more time to the strange romance between John Doe and Colonel Novikova, to the idea of an end to the temporary alliance between U.S. and Soviet forces. Novikova asked John, "Does the prospect of being enemies again excite you?" A whole universe of grown-up love and lust in those words to which, alas, we shall never be privy outside of inference. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja, number 16 from 1990 in Marvel Comics. And so finally, with heavy heart, we turn at last to the final issue of the series, ended far too soon. The final chapter in the sadly truncated saga of the Nth Man. That premature end hangs like a pall over the proceedings as every loose thread from the plot of the previous 15 issues is neatly tied. Nothing is left hanging as the story to date is revealed to be an insidious time loop, one which can only be closed through another trip backwards to the very beginning of the story, with Alfie and John left as orphans on the doorstep of the Maryvale Home for Boys on February 3rd, 1959, no less, a date of cosmic significance on their Earth as well as ours. Frankly, there's something mildly deflating about the ending being the resolution of a closed time loop, a destination surely intended from the beginning, but which, as resolved in the final pages, can't but seem abrupt. The final battle with the great cosmic threat Magubgub occupies the first part of the issue, the ultimate battle for the Ultimate Ninja, and, since this is first and foremost a Larry Hama comic, you must believe the indescribable cosmic threat is dispatched by some good old-fashioned ninja handwork. The series' implicit premise, a showdown between Snake Eyes and Dr. Manhattan, plays out more or less like you might expect, with the noble ninja putting a stop to the world historical rampage of a weak man driven mad by power beyond measure. We're also granted closure regarding the final disposition of the series' great antagonist, the Soviet femme fatale Varvara Novikova, undone at the last by her profession of true love for the one man in the world she regarded as an equal, and for whom the end of the world was merely a backdrop to the most dangerous game of all, flirting with a ninja. In the 33 years since the end of the Nth Man, these characters have remained firmly ensconced at their creator's behest in a dignified limbo, unconnected to the larger Marvel multiverse, even as events such as Secret Wars could easily have provided means for their return, had anyone remembered. Of course, there's still the matter of Excalibur 27. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Excalibur 27 from 1990 in Marvel Comics. The saga of the Nth Man comes to an end in an X-Men crossover that saw print the same month as the series' final issue. This represents something of an old-school impulse. Used to be, when a title was cancelled, standard practice for loose ends to be tied up in another series, which also enabled the recycling of story elements. No other student of the old school than Chris Claremont wrote this issue during the tail end of his tenure on the X-Men's UK branch. The plot here picks up from the middle of the Nth Man, with Alfie's giant magic television makes contact with the magic television of another nigh omnipotent reality warper, Jamie Braddock, sibling to Captain Britain and Psylocke, an occasional ex-antagonist. As soon as Braddock becomes aware of Alfie across the dimensions, he can't resist meddling. Suddenly, Dr. Candy Goodstroke appears in downtown London. When Excalibur arrive to investigate, they find two of their own. Nightcrawler and the Rachel Summers Phoenix exchange places with none other than John Doe and Varvara Novikova, certain that everything they see is still part of Alfie's mind games. So, with John Doe in Nightcrawler's outfit and Colonel Novakova dressed in Phoenix's red spiked leathers, the Nth Man leads the rest of Excalibur on a merry chase through the studio warehouse. Meanwhile, the main event of the issue comes when Phoenix takes on Alfie. The latter isn't happy to find someone else has been messing with his toys, but if we know anything about Alfie, it's that he's terrible at fighting and a coward. In a match between a confused Alfie Omegan and an enraged Phoenix force, it's not much of a fight. Soon enough, Nightcrawler figures out how to use Alfie's TV remote to fast-forward reality, effectively depositing everyone back where they belong. The strangest thing about this book is the art team, Barry Windsor-Smith and Bill Sienkiewicz. Why did they draw this comic book? This issue, A Quick Journey to the World of a Low-Selling Alternate Reality series, doesn't appear to have any reason to exist, other than that Chris Claremont must have really liked the Nth Man, and wanted to pay tribute to Larry Hama and Ron Wagner's achievement the best way he knew how, by writing the characters into an X-Men book.